Senator Rob Portman, a Republican of Ohio. He's also a former U.S. Trade Representative. Senator, thanks for being here. We've been getting into the real specifics of what might have happened, and we finally decided that, we didn't decide, but one of our guests who at least had a strong opinion was that the Chinese overplayed their hand in terms of actually putting into administrative law some of the agreements that we thought we had arrived on, and that when they pulled back on that Lighthizer said we got to draw the line right here. Do you know exactly what happened?
No, Joe, I don't, but that sounds like a plausible explanation. I think it's broadly speaking what you're talking about, which is that the Chinese had made certain concessions in the discussions. And frankly, I think Vice Premier Liu wants to make these changes because they're ultimately good for China and good for trade, and not just with the United States, Joe, but as you know, a lot of other countries are watching what we're doing and are prepared to be more aggressive vis-a-vis China as well. But I think he probably also has had some issues with President Xi and with the leadership in China, and one might be the inability to put it into statutory language. But there's some very significant structural changes, as you know, that we're asking for, all of which are very fair. And I do hope that Vice Premier Liu and his team, when they come in tomorrow, are prepared to talk about those. We've got to deal with the licensing agreements. We've got to deal with the joint ventures. We've got to deal with the general theft of technology and intellectual property. So it's more than just rebalancing the trade deficit.
Would you have ever, 5 years ago, thought that you'd say something like, I support this administration's aggressive action to address China's inequities through tariffs? Could you have ever seen yourself as a tariff person? And there are a lot of people in that position right now too, that somehow it's distasteful and wouldn't be the first choice, but you finally come to accept that this is something that needs to be done. Is that where you are?
Yeah, I am, and as you know, I have been for a while, in the sense that even when I was at USTR, China was my #1 focus. He took me to the WTO and won the first case there against them. I had a prosecutor just for China. We really focused on it because at that time they were using some of the tactics that they have only increased since then to try to, frankly, take advantage of the international trade rules, even though they were in the WTO. So, yeah, it was a time of reckoning, I think, in this last year, where we have finally said, okay, we've got to resolve these issues. So I have been supportive of this, even though on other tariff issues like 232, as you know, I have not been able to support what the president's been doing. But here, I think he's right. And I think the hope is that on Friday we do not have to increase the tariffs on the $200 billion from 10 to 25%, because we'll get back to the discussions and because there will be serious constructive discussions in the next 2 days.
So what do you I don't know who your point of contact is for all this, but do you think there's a possibility that something happens before tomorrow? It's tomorrow night, actually, or Friday morning, however you want to characterize it. But do you think that that's actually possible that this all gets taken back? I mean, the markets would certainly like to know if there's a chance.
Yeah, I do, because ultimately, again, I think it's in China's interest to resolve these issues. And I'm going to choose to look at the donut rather than the hole. How about that, Joe?
Well, you know, those little holes are good, too. What are they called? The munchkins?
Well, you don't have those behind you, though.
Those are good, too. No, I don't.
Hey, Senator,
whole donut.
Can you give us a little bit of color on the meeting that took place at the White House that you were involved in on this topic, and also where you stand and where you think the president stands on auto tariffs?
It was a good debate. I mean, we talked about the fundamental issues of trade, you know, whether tariffs make sense or not. I mean, ultimately, the goal of the United States ought to be to reduce tariffs and reduce non-tariff barriers. And I think that really is the question. You know, by increasing tariffs, let's say, on China in order to get an agreement, I think you can get a lot of consensus, including, as we saw earlier, from Chuck Schumer and a lot of Republicans, because we understand that there's an imbalance now, that there are some unfair trade practices going on. But that shouldn't be the ultimate goal. The ultimate goal should be to have a world where there are fewer taxes, fewer burdens, and that's in the United States' interest.
But was your sense that the president was in favor of auto tariffs?
Well, I think he's intrigued by the idea. Let's put it that way. I'll let him speak for himself. But, you know, I think has a little different view. Was that the debate inside
the room, to the extent that you can sort of bring us inside that room?
It was a spirited discussion. I'll say that. But, you know, ultimately, you've heard the president, after the G7, he said this. He said on other occasions that he'd like to see a world where you have a reduction of tariffs and non-tariff barriers on both sides. And I think, again, we need to keep to that objective. If that's the objective, I think you're not only going to see a consensus here in Congress, but you're going to see a better economy for the United States. I mean, I think long term, by increasing tariffs on both sides, it's going to hurt our economy. Not
If
help
it was
our
such a spirited discussion, though, if you're an automaker today, even just hearing our conversation, should you be anxious that that's where the president wants to go with this?
You're anxious again.
We'll see. We'll see. I can't tell you. I really can't tell you, and I don't think anybody else can either.
Senator, is the new NAFTA USMCA, is that going to pass?
I believe it will, Becky. Again, I may be looking at the donut rather than the hole here, being a little more optimistic, but let's face it, it's a better agreement in every respect for Democrats in Congress. For some Republicans, there are some concerns about it, things like the minimum wage in Mexico for some of the auto workers or some of the rules of origin, domestic content rules. I do think ultimately it's a better agreement than NAFTA, partly because it's just updated. And I do think if you're a Democrat, you're looking at the alternatives of existing NAFTA versus USMCA. USMCA is better, I believe, in every regard. So logic should prevail here, right? So ultimately, this should pass.
I like the holes better than the donuts. I do. But they're still 75 calories, 75, 80 calories. Those little glazed.
Yep, they are.
Hey, Senator, I'd be remiss. We're both from Cincinnati. Are there glimmers of hope? I'm thinking 500 ball is not that far off. I see glimmers. I see some runs scored. I see some pitching. Is it possible the Reds are maybe going to get to 500? Or am I smoking something? What do you think?
Now, again, I'm going to be optimistic here. I went to the game on Saturday night, 9-2, incredible victory over the Giants. More home runs were hit that night than almost the entire season.
Inning,
so,
right,
yeah. But it was awesome, and our pitching's better. Let's face it, we've got some of the best pitchers in the
I'm gonna start watching. Bengals,
our division.
Forget it, hopeless, never. They're done. But Reds, I'm still.
Not a bad draft. We'll see what happens.
Okay. All right.
All right, guys.
All right.
Take care.
See you. Thanks.
Good to see you.